T.S. Eliot's poem, The Hollow Men, ends with the following lines. "This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper." These oft-quoted lines serve as the conclusion of a work whose subject is the spiritually bereft, those who, by all external indications, seem to be alive, but are, for various reasons, dead on the inside. It's really quite emo when you think about it. Eliot's poem is a meditation on people who find themselves utterly lost in a world of ever-changing social relations and increasingly convoluted abstractions. But here's a hot take for you. If we are to take the entirety of Neon Genesis Evangelion seriously, the world ends with both a bang and a whimper. In fact, the bang and the whimper are one and the same. Hello and welcome to Nightmare Masterclass. My name is David Stockdale. I'll be your host on this excursion into the dark unknown. Neon Genesis Evangelion is an anime series created and directed by Hideaki Anno. The original series aired from 1995 to 1996. A number of films have been released since. And with Evangelion's Netflix debut in 2019, the show has experienced something of a resurgence in popularity. The fourth and final installment of Evangelion's Rebuild film series was released in August of this year. There have been multiple Evangelion endings at this point, all of which I'll be discussing in this video. If you haven't already watched the original series, Evangelion, I will just say right off the bat that the series merits your attention. I find it particularly relevant at this time for reasons that I'll soon get into. For now, it would suffice to say that the intersection between human relationships and Cataclysm within Evangelion strikes me as incredibly prescient in the year of our Lord 2021. How people make sense of their place in the world in the wake of apocalyptic events is certainly an important theme, and it's something I'll try not to lose sight of in the course of this analysis. But staying focused has proven challenging. There are a multitude of potentially generative references within the work, which could lead in any number of interesting directions. And there are clever metatextual elements throughout every iteration. Evangelion is a veritable treasure trove of interesting commentary and mystical allusions, but a convincing interpretation that ties these references together in a coherent framework is not immediately obvious. Admittedly, aspects of the work remain ambiguous to me, but that's a part of what makes an analysis like this worth doing. It is fairly clear that Evangelion lampoons much of the anime that preceded it, in particular shows within the mecha genre. The Gundam franchise comes to mind. The presence of Anno weighs heavily in the discourse surrounding Evangelion. It's well known that the director was experiencing a bout of depression during the creation of the original series. It's also well known that the end of Evangelion is something of a response to disgruntled fans who weren't pleased with how the original series ended. Anno famously included a crowd's reaction to the film's conclusion within the film itself. A documentary was recently released on the development of Thrice Upon a Time, the final installment of Evangelion's Rebuild films. Hideaki Anno, the final challenge of Evangelion, chronicles the production team's struggles as they scramble to finish Evangelion's final iteration before their deadline. If the documentary is any indication, Anno is a reserved man with a meticulous, one might say, obsessive directorial approach. A hallmark of his work, and this is the case with Evangelion in particular, is the tendency to include abstract, non-linear elements, including heady sequences chronicling a given character's stream of consciousness. And of course, there are the infamously open-ended resolutions. Evangelion features numerous plot points in which children are placed into situations significantly beyond their level of maturity. This is a common theme in the series. Importantly, the series depicts the consequences, or rather, the psychological damage that is wrought by putting children into positions beyond their ability to handle. In some sense, the entire population has been thrust into such a position. Evangelion occurs in the wake of a cataclysmic event that has rendered the nations of the world in total disarray. The main action of the series takes place in 2015. The second impact, as it is referred to in the series, occurred in the year 2000. Precise details of the second impact in terms of the lore of the series is not all that important in my mind. What is important is that the Eva pilots, the so-called children, do not know of a world unscathed by global catastrophes. Even the most relatively well-adjusted adult characters in the series have been traumatized by the second impact. In 2021, this hits a little too close to home. In light of this information, it's interesting to me that Evangelion was created in the wake of an economic crash in Japan, which resulted in a stark decrease in the production of anime within the country. The so-called lost decades of Japan occurred when an economic bubble burst in 1991. After a period of wild speculation and the expansion of credit, the valuation of various assets, primarily stocks and real estate, became inflated. Asset prices subsequently collapsed, causing a prolonged period of stagnation. Japan's GDP dropped from 5.4 trillion in 1995 to 4 trillion just 3 years later in 1998. This was an abysmal occurrence for the people of Japan. Real wages dropped about 5%. In certain respects, the country is still dealing with the fallout, and needless to say, now they have certain recent global events to deal with on top of that. While Evangelion is often credited with revitalizing the animation industry in Japan, I would argue that the fallen world in which the story of Evangelion takes place is central to the show's increased cultural resonance over the years. In response to a certain recent 20-year anniversary, a quote by Hunter S. Thompson has been making the rounds on Twitter. "We are at war now, according to President Bush, and I take him at his word. He also says this war might last for a very long time. Generals and military scholars will tell you that 8 or 10 years is actually not such a long time in the span of human history," which is no doubt true, but history tells us that 10 years of martial law and wartime economy are going to feel like a lifetime to people who are in their 20s today. The poor bastards of what will forever be known as Generation Z are doomed to be the first generation of Americans who will grow up with a lower standard of living than their parents enjoyed. That is extremely heavy news, and it will take a while for it to sink in. The 22 babies born in New York City while the World Trade Center burned will never know what they missed. The last half of the 20th century will seem like a wild party for rich kids compared to what's coming now. The party's over, folks. To be sure, the historical situation in the US is distinct, but that bit about kids being born in the wake of a globally significant event feels pertinent to this discussion. The terms martial law and wartime economy also resonate, especially when it comes to Evangelion. The Eva pilots and other children in the series do not know of a world prior to the event known as the Second Impact. And the system of governance that emerges in the wake of this catastrophe is basically a technocratic dictatorship. Again, this is all hitting a bit too close to home. The Evangelions, or Evas, are essentially giant cyborgs. They were developed by NERV, an organization funded by the UN and tasked with repelling mysterious beings known as angels. Evas were created from the genetic material of captured angels, specifically Adam, and in the case of Unit 1, Shinji's Eva, an angel called Lilith. Though externally Evas appear to be robots, it's important to keep in mind that they are living creatures. Mechanical components have been grafted onto their bodies in order to control them. Subsequently, Evas are forced to carry out NERV's various directives with the aid of human pilots, whose nervous systems are linked with their own in a hellish process of synergy. At times, it seems quite unpleasant for all parties involved. The better synchronized pilots are with their Evas, the better their performance in battle. But pilots also feel everything their Evas feel, so when they're wounded in battle, pilots routinely experience agonizing pain. It is critically important to the broader themes of the work that children are made to feel agonizing pain at the behest of their elders, who tend to sit in air-conditioned command centers and repeatedly tell the pilots to quit complaining. So too are Evas bound in servitude. In this sense, there's an important connection between Evas and their pilots. At times, it seems that Evas are capable of exercising agency. In some cases, Evas inexplicably go berserk, causing all kinds of damage to their surroundings. And at one point in the show, Unit 1, Shinji's Eva, refuses to accept the dummy plug, an autonomous computer system meant to take the place of the human pilot. Unit 1 only allowed Shinji to be its pilot. In the original series, it is insinuated that the spirit of Shinji's deceased mother Yui inhabits Unit 1 as the result of a lab accident, kind of like the love-matic grandpa from The Simpsons. It's clear that, in some sense, Shinji's connection to his mother is critical to his ability to pilot the Eva. Within the fictional universe of Evangelion, it is stated that only 14-year-old kids possess the ability to pilot these creatures. It's never made explicitly clear why this is, but it is notable that all Eva pilots were born in the year after the second impact. Shinji in particular carries a weighty chip on his shoulder throughout the series. It is said that Shinji is uniquely capable as an Eva pilot. His exceptional synchronization rate with Unit 1 is noted in various high-stakes battles. This is the work's in-universe explanation for the immense pressure placed upon Shinji in particular. Whether or not Shinji chooses to pilot his Eva in a given scenario tends to be a major plot point. The protagonist's chronic ambivalence is, at times, really quite grating, but it makes sense for the character for a number of reasons. In part, Shinji's indecisiveness is a function of the protagonist's estranged relationship with his father, Gendo, the director of NERV. The organization relies heavily on Shinji and the other Eva pilots to protect the Earth from the angels. Without the pilots and their respective Evangelions to protect the Earth, it is said that the angels will initiate an event known as the Third Impact, leading to the total annihilation of the planet. As far as the kids are concerned, the fate of the planet is literally at stake, and they are the last line of defense. Traditional weapons do not work against angels. Pilots generally perform better when they're in touch with their own emotions, when they've allowed their defensive walls to come down. The three pilots and their various interactions with the Evas serve as a clever metaphor to represent human connection in general. After all, in the universe of Evangelion, Evas are based on angels, and angels are said to be different types of humans. Evas and their respective pilots are not all that different. There's a term often used in the series called the AT field, which at first seems to be a special kind of force field that both Evas and angels can generate. In order to defeat an angel, it is often the case that the Eva must penetrate its AT field. But the term does get used in contexts other than battle. In the 24th episode, it is said that AT fields are the inner walls that everyone has inside themselves. In other words, AT fields represent the defensive barriers that we put up to protect ourselves from those that we don't fully trust. And in Evangelion, trust is in extremely short supply. AT fields inhibit one's connection with others, yet they are also necessary in order to maintain a coherent sense of identity. After all, when Rei loses her composure, it is specifically stated that her AT field was no longer able to maintain her form. This touches on an interesting double bind that gets fleshed out in both the conclusion of the original series and the end of Evangelion. More on that later. Evangelion contains many references to intellectual and mystical traditions. That's part of what makes the work so interesting. But it raises a question. Without any obvious indication as to what exactly these references mean in relation to the work, for instance, one might ask why it is that the Kabbalah is heavily referenced. Where the heck do we start? I can envision a decent argument to support the idea that Evangelion lends itself towards some kind of psychological analysis. One might even say it lends itself to a Freudian psychoanalytical reading, or at least the nature of the psyche is worth talking about in relation to this body of work. You don't have to be a Freudian or even take psychoanalysis all that seriously to appreciate how Evangelion navigates the terrain of the psyche. But it should be noted that there are undeniable references to Freud's ideas within the series. For instance, one of the titles of episode 19 is Introjection. Introjection is the process by which one internalizes certain aspects of other people, their ideas, their values, their feelings, etc. This is not something that occurs consciously. Rather, it is automatic, and it's an inevitable consequence of being a person. But it is said that some are more susceptible. The psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott notes, individuals with weak ego boundaries are more prone to use introjection as a defense mechanism. In other words, when someone doesn't have a good sense of their own identity, the path of least resistance is often simply adopting the values and attitudes of those around them in order to avoid any potential hostility. Winnicott provides a rather telling example of introjection. When a child envelops representational images of his absent parents into himself, simultaneously fusing them with his own personality. This is especially interesting in relation to our angst-ridden protagonist, Shinji. Put simply, Shinji has internalized a value system that is not his own, and his actions often reflect this. Despite Shinji's oft-stated ambivalence with respect to humanity's ongoing war with these things called angels, he nonetheless carries out his missions at the behest of his father and other parental figures in his life. He does things merely for the approval of others. The show practically beats you over the head with this fact, and the small bit of praise Shinji receives from his father after piloting the Eva is a major event in his life. It's worth asking if Gendo was keeping his son at arm's length purposefully in order to instill a sort of Pavlovian response to any meager bit of his father's attention. It's undeniable that a major component of this series in terms of its thematic content is the coercion and manipulation of kids at the behest of an obsessive narcissist backed by a shadowy cabal of unknown but extremely influential world figures. The show makes it clear that Gendo is intentionally manipulating his son along with the rest of the Eva pilots. In the same manner that human teenagers pilot the Evas and get them to perform godlike feats, so too are the major players in this story controlling things behind the scenes. Evangelion develops a strange sort of in-universe language in which it's difficult to distinguish between the show's thematic content and the actual events that take place, plot-wise. As previously stated, Evas have shown the capacity to exercise their own will at various points in the series. It would seem that it is only through, I don't want to say consent because their armor has been attached by nerve for the express purpose of confining them. And let's not forget that Evas do tend to go berserk from time to time. But when a pilot syncs up with its Eva and performs according to plan, one gets the sense that for whatever reason, the Eva has somehow allowed itself to be controlled in this way. My point is, the pilots are in the exact same position. Each of the pilots is emotionally damaged in some way. Later in the series, it is revealed that all of the students in Shinji's classroom are Eva pilot candidates. In hindsight, one gets the sense that most of them are just too damn well adjusted to be viable candidates. You see, the fact that the pilots are troubled individuals is no coincidence. It makes them vulnerable, which makes them easier to control. These kids have developed various defense mechanisms in response to their respective childhood traumas. Gendo Ikari takes advantage of this. He makes use of their perceived inadequacies and their defense mechanisms in subtle ways in order to achieve his aims. Asuka's desperate need to be recognized ultimately stems from her mother's death. In the wake of that traumatic event, she developed a thick shell, a persona largely capable of only one emotion, anger. Asuka's anger is quite useful in battle, and her desperate need to prove herself in order to be recognized makes her a prime candidate for Eva pilot. Rei is quite literally the culmination of this drive to control and manipulate others. It is insinuated within the show that she was created for the express purpose of carrying out Gendo's bidding. Rei's inability to connect with others further isolates her, making her more vulnerable to Gendo's manipulation. It is made clear that multiple versions of Rei have existed. Rei herself states that she is replaceable. This knowledge is cursed. It's strongly insinuated that if Rei ever defies orders, she will simply be replaced with another version of herself. Lastly, Gendo Ikari very consciously targets and manipulates his son. and wittingly or otherwise, his subordinates at Nerve actively take part as well. I would say this sort of manipulation amounts to a form of coercion, but the work explicitly shows us how the pilots are complicit as well. Over the course of the show's run, Shinji has multiple opportunities to quit. No one tries to stop him, but each time he threatens to stop piloting the Eva, he eventually returns. The work very pointedly calls attention to Shinji's indecisiveness. It's true that he's being emotionally manipulated by his father, but Shinji also feels a sense of responsibility towards his friends, and I suppose he doesn't want the world to end either. By the end of the series, we, the audience, are left wondering if it's even possible to parse all the toxic guilt and shame from anything good that might be driving these characters' actions. The short answer is, it's complicated. The long answer, I believe, has something to do with the human condition, the inherent beauty, tragedy, and absurdity of human existence. Or at least that's what is strongly suggested by the work. Evangelion attacks this from multiple angles. The most compelling suggestion to me is a single philosophical reference made in the original series. Episode 16 is titled The Sickness Unto Death and Then. Sickness unto death is a concept that is most commonly associated with the existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. He's known for the assertion that despair is the sickness unto death. In his book, The Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard attempts to wrap his mind around what it means to be human. But also note that he was responding to some of the bigger names in philosophy at the time, namely Hegel. In this introductory passage of Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard parodies the way Hegel wrote. A human being is a spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. A human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is a relation between two. Considered in this way, a human being is still not a self. In the relation between two, the relation is the third as a negative unity, and the two relate to the relation and in the relation to the relation. Thus, under the qualification of the psychical, the relation between the psychical and the physical is a relation. If, however, the relation relates itself to itself, this relation is the positive third, and this is the self. So, Kierkegaard is making fun of Hegel, but he's also making a serious argument here. What is he really saying? For starters, Kierkegaard argued that the self is not one thing. Rather, it is a relation, or more precisely, it's a process of relating to a relation. To paraphrase the late philosopher Roderick, we are constituted in a paradoxical condition in which we can think in a utopian manner about what the world could be like. We can even imagine the concept of infinity, and yet we're hopelessly stuck here in the real world. A limited, banal experience in which the utopian wonders we imagine cannot ever fully manifest. In this sense, a human is a synthesis between our desire for absolute freedom and the recognition of abject necessity. That is to say, the human condition is a process of navigating the terrain of our desires in conjunction with the terrain of what's actually the case in reality. This is what it means to be a person. Because we are a relation, we are inherently incomplete. Kierkegaard argued that psychology cannot be an effective remedy for the real problem here, because this despairing condition is actually what defines a person. The self is this despairing relation. And yet, Kierkegaard notes that despair alone cannot kill you. Literally speaking, there is not the slightest possibility that anyone will die from this sickness or that it will end in physical death. He goes on to say, thus, it has more in common with the situation of a mortally ill person who lies struggling with death and yet cannot die. Thus, to be sick unto death is to be unable to die, and yet not as if there was hope for life. But when we learn to know the even greater danger, we hope for death. when the danger is so great that death becomes the hope, then despair is the hopelessness of not even being able to die. Dark stuff. But Kierkegaard, a Christian philosopher, poses a solution to this type of despair. Not surprisingly, he says that one must embrace Christ. But Kierkegaard was a special kind of Christian philosopher because he fully admitted that this answer is absurd. Nonetheless, he invites you to embrace this paradoxical solution, or at the very least, earnestly wrestle with the problem of despair. This is all the more noteworthy considering the numerous allusions to Christian mythology and iconography throughout Evangelion. Kaoru's story in particular seems to mirror that of Jesus himself. What are we to make of all this? Is Evangelion merely a hodgepodge of philosophical and mystical references? Well, in a sense, yes. But it's also more than that, which becomes apparent when you take a step back and look at the entire gestalt, if you will. The last 2 episodes in the series were subject to a fair amount of scrutiny amongst viewers. These episodes are difficult to summarize. It's really something you should experience yourself, as opposed to having it relayed in a rote fashion to you by a tired, aging YouTuber. Having said that, the original ending of the series merits a lengthy exegesis all its own. If I had to summarize my thoughts on the ending, it would be as follows. There's a central contradiction at the core of Evangelion. Note that this is not a logical contradiction in the formal sense, but rather a contradiction more along the lines of Hegel's use of the term. The series depicts opposing points of view in reference to the very concept of a person. The contradiction itself is difficult to describe because at its core, it's ultimately a matter of identity. What constitutes a person? What defines an individual? The scope of this question is confounding because the concept of an individual presupposes the concept of a dividual, a distributed or collective entity. Further complicating matters is the fact that the human body is an ecosystem in and of itself. There are about 10 times more microbes in the human body than there are human cells. We exist in a symbiotic relationship with these organisms. So too do Eva pilots exist in a similar manner with their respective Evas. So who is to say where the Eva ends and the person begins? There's an episode in which Shinji becomes trapped in his Eva and begins to lose his sense of self. This leads to a trippy sort of stream of consciousness sequence in which Shinji grapples with the concept of enemies and more broadly questions his motivations for piloting the Eva. It is said that Shinji's body lost the delineation of its ego boundary. Subsequently, Nerve's salvage operation entails reconstituting Shinji's body and inserting his ego back into it. Yet, in the episode, we the viewers can see that Shinji is not only present in some capacity, he's on the brink of achieving some kind of epiphany. One gets the sense that this experience is similar to that of a person on psychedelics. After all, ego death is a common experience associated with this class of drugs. More generally, why do we draw the line where we do when it comes to what defines a person? This is a weighty metaphysical question, to be sure, but it's one that the work is deeply concerned with. As the so-called Human Instrumentality Project commences towards the end of the series, Shinji has the option to maintain humanity as a sort of unity, thus eliminating the possibility of misunderstanding. The very concept of the other necessitates misunderstanding. It is stated time and time again in the work that one can never truly understand another person. It's impossible. Is this a pessimistic notion, or is the show merely pointing out the obvious? To me, it's the latter. The key lies in the conclusion of the series. One can never completely understand another person with 100% fidelity. Sometimes it appears as though the spiritual and psychological gap between you and others is so vast that it seems impossible to even remotely understand where another person is really coming from. And sometimes, even when you give it the old college try, you end up getting hurt. But this does not justify any kind of psychological regression into a solipsistic escape fantasy. It's still worth it to keep trying to connect with people, even if it means that pain is inevitable. This is Shinji's conclusion, at the end of the original series, and it's why everybody congratulates him. Shinji actively chooses to redivide the collective humanity of the world back into individuals. He chooses to have other people in the world despite the inevitable outcome of misunderstanding. Pain and misunderstanding are sometimes the price one pays for intimacy, that rare moment when it seems as though you really can connect with another person. And those are the moments that make life worth it. As best I can gather, this is the message of the original series. Critics have often ascribed an altogether different character to the end of Evangelion, the so-called complementary ending released in the wake of an outcry amongst fans. You see, the original conclusion of the series is quite unconventional. It is often claimed that the reason for Eva's weird ending is that the production experienced significant budget cuts. Whether or not this is true remains unclear to me. As best I can gather, the show's haphazard ending had more to do with creative problems. Namely, the show's creator was struggling to convey what he had envisioned in his mind. Not an uncommon problem. But I think it makes sense to take the term complementary ending at face value and contextualize the conclusion of the end of Evangelion in relation to the conclusion of the original series. While the original ending is quite evidently positive and uplifting in its own way, the end of Evangelion is often characterized as the total opposite. And there are good reasons for this, but it would be too simplistic to say that the original ending is optimistic and the complementary ending is pessimistic. The end of Evangelion assumes a certain valence in relation to the original ending. It is confounding in certain respects, it complicates certain messages brought to bear in the series proper, but again, I would like to take the term complementary ending at face value. Perhaps these endings complement one another in the sense that red complements green, or yellow complements purple. By virtue of possessing such starkly opposing characteristics, the conclusion of the show and the end of Evangelion serve to better illuminate one another. The end of Evangelion serves to highlight the thematic content of the original ending, and vice versa. Thrice Upon a Time is the final film in the Rebuild of Evangelion series. It premiered after a long delay in March of this year and had an international release in August. In Thrice Upon a Time, the settlement of Impact survivors is filled with some of the most remarkably well-adjusted people you will ever meet. Relative to how characters were depicted throughout the series proper, that is, isolated, atomized, and alienated, this is a stark divergence. Why are these people so remarkably well-adjusted? Toji notes that there was a period of immense difficulty following the third impact. Yet, in the wake of this horrible event, a group of people have managed to come together and foster a relatively bustling community filled with relatively happy people. Importantly, they are survivors. They all seem to have an immense feeling of gratitude for simply being alive at a time when so many others have perished. This sense of zest for life is even reflected in their environmental practices. There is an elaborate sequence in which Kensuke, now a survivalist, takes Shinji up to the mountains and explains various habits meant to achieve a more sustainable world. This community has come to appreciate life so greatly that they've achieved a broader perspective on what it means to build a society. Subsequently, they've come to recognize that an essential component of a functional society is a deep sense of responsibility and conscientiousness towards the planet itself. So too does this sense of responsibility extend to other people. The Rebuild film series diverges from the original TV series in a number of ways. One of the most interesting is its general depiction of Rei Ayanami. To put it simplistically, Rei is more human in the Rebuild series. More attention is dedicated to fleshing her out as a character. Notably, Rei attempts to act as something of a mediator between Shinji and his father. She even plans a dinner party in order for the two to come together and perhaps foster some kind of connection. Tragically, this ends up being a bust. Over the course of the Rebuild films, it is established that Rei is a clone, one of many from the Ayanami series, based on the DNA of Shinji's mother, Yui. In the last two films, it is established that the Rei from the beginning of the story is not present. Yet another clone assumes Rei's identity. Yet, the general theme of what it means to be human is still present within the exploration of this new character, this doppelganger. When Ray's copy first enters the settlement, she doesn't understand the first thing about living in a community like this. She doesn't even understand the concept of a baby. She's never seen one before. The villagers start calling her Miss Lookalike. The way in which various community members help Miss Lookalike integrate into the community is, in my view, a central component of the film's overall message. Practically an entire act of the movie is dedicated not to Ray, but to Miss Lookalike's character arc. In summary, Miss Lookalike is taught what it means to live in a community of people that care for one another. She learns to farm. She washes her clothes in the river with the rest of the villagers. Miss Lookalike becomes close friends with these people by virtue of their common dependence on one another. It's a utopian sentiment, but in my reading of the film, this utopia is depicted in order to stress the utopian potential that exists within our own society, even in the wake of great catastrophes. Tragically, Miss Lookalike eventually loses her composure. In the film, this is due to her construction as an artificial human. It is explained that she requires constant exposure to a liquid known as LCL. Importantly, LCL is used throughout Evangelion as a conduit to link pilots to their Evas. It helps establish a mental connection, and a lack of LCL, i.e. connection, initiates a process by which Miss Lookalike disintegrates right before Shinji's eyes. Broadly speaking, the work is stressing the importance of human connection. Without it, we create the conditions for our own disintegration. I initially wanted to talk about this series because I feel as though it is remarkably prescient in terms of its thematic content. The children of Evangelion only know of a world filled with turmoil and horror. They were born in the wake of the Second Impact. So too are the children of today entering a frightening scenario. It's more than any one person can reasonably be expected to handle, and yet it appears at this stage they will be forced to deal with the consequences, and soon enough they will be in the pilot seat. Will this new generation allow themselves to be manipulated in order to achieve the ends of desperate old men, such as the likes of Gendo Ikari, or will they find a way to build a better world? That wraps it up for this installment of Nightmare Masterclass. If you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on a monthly basis at patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Thank you for watching, and good night.